Hello. Right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CJS special noon lecture. My name is Kyotaro Tsutsui. I'm associate professor in the Department of Sociology here at the University of Michigan. Before I introduce the speaker today, I have two announcements to make. One is that CJS fall film series, the Studio Ghibli collection, a 30-year retrospective, is in full swing, and we have a viewing tonight of Porco Rosso, Red Pig, basically, at 7 p.m. at the State Theater. And as some of you may have heard, the director Hayao Miyazaki received an honorary Oscar last week, Saturday, and there will be he's not going to make an appearance in person, but we will see his acceptance speech or something to that effect at the beginning of the viewing tonight. The second announcement is about CJS regular noon lecture. Today we have a special lecture, but it's not in place of the regular lecture. We will have a CJS noon lecture tomorrow at noon, and we have Professor Dennis Frost speaking about the Paralympic movement, disability and sports in post-war Japan. It's in the same building, but across the hall in room 1636. Right? And today I'm deeply honored to introduce Professor Ezra Vogel. He's an icon, a legend in Japan studies, doesn't really need an introduction, so I'll try to be brief. He was born and raised in Ohio. Professor Vogel earned his bachelor's degree from Ohio Wesleyan University in 1950, and then he, after serving for 2 years in the US Army, he moved to Harvard, got his PhD in sociology in 1958. He taught at Yale for a few years, but aside from that, he's been 1 year. Okay, aside from that, his entire career he spent at Harvard University, serving as director and chair for various different centers and institutions at Harvard until his retirement in 2000. So his current title is Henry Ford II Professor of the Social Sciences, Emeritus at Harvard University. And he has published a number of books and articles, starting with Japan's New Middle Class in 1963 and Canton under Communism in 1969, which combined to demonstrate his capacity to conduct first-rate field work in Japan and in China. He's fluent in Japanese and Chinese. And he went on to write Japan as #1 Lessons for America, which most of you know, came out in 1979. He's probably most well known for this book in Japan, as it is the Japanese edition of this book is the all-time bestseller in Japan of nonfiction by a Western author. And the book proved auspicious as Japan became seemingly unbeatable, unstoppable economic behemoth in the 1980s. In 1985, he wrote Comeback, Case by Case, Building the Resurgence of American Business, in which he charted the course for the American economy to make a comeback, which it did in the 1990s. And after that, he spent 8 months in 1987 in China, in Guangdong province, observing the early efforts to execute an economic reform in China, and he wrote One Step Ahead in China, Guangdong Under Reform in 1989. Again, he was a prophet, and you know what happened to the Chinese economy since then. And he also wrote The Four Little Dragons, The Spread of Industrialization in East Asia in 1991. Four Little Dragons being Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, all of which have had success in economic areas. So you can see the pattern now. Professor Vogel has this Midas touch, studying a country that's kind of on the rise and really turning really the economic fortunes of those countries, or making them reach new heights. And as you might expect, a lot of Japanese people since the 90s wanted him to say something more about Japan, something nice about Japan. He revisited Japan in his 2000 book, Is Japan Still #1? You can see the ambivalence in the title of the book. This is the only book that he's written that has a question mark in the title, and his ambivalence doomed the Japanese economy probably, and Japan is still kind of struggling. So we're hoping that soon enough he will write a book on Japan that has a more definitive title, even if it's Japan is one of the top 3 or Japan in the final 4 or something. And he has earned many prizes and honorary degrees, too many to list. He's given lectures in English, Japanese, and Chinese all over the world. It's amazing the kind of travel schedule that he has. And we in Japan Studies, we all owe a huge amount of debt to him, directly or indirectly, as he really spent a lot of time and effort trying to nurture future scholars of Japan. And today we are privileged to hear his reflections on the 6 decades of his engagement with Japan Studies. So please join me in welcoming Professor Ezra Vogel.
Thanks so much. Great introduction. Thank you very much for that extravagant introduction. One thing Kyo didn't know, and that is that in order to graduate from Ohio Wesleyan, I was in a big hurry. And so I wanted to do it in 3 years, and I wanted to go to summer school. And the summer of 1950, I came to the University of Michigan and spent summer school here. And so I'm proud to return after a few years from 1950. And of course, I've been back often and had a chance to see what goes on here. As an old person, I appreciate your willingness to let me sit down and be more comfortable. I did have a lot of good fortune, and as Kyo said, I started working on Japan before it really took off, and so then after I studied it, it took off, and then I studied the Four Little Dragons, and they took off, and then I studied China, and now China has taken off. And when I was giving a talk one day at Harvard, one of the people in finance working for one of the big stock companies says, "Professor Vogel, what place are you going to study next?" So I've had a lot of good fortune. I feel, what should old people talk about? You probably know that in a lot of Indian tribes, it was a custom for a senior member of the tribe to talk about history, to sort of educate the young people about their tribe and tell about the history. So what I see as my responsibility today is sort of describe sort of the history of the field of Japanese studies, and particularly, of course, I'll give you my own experience. And since people are interested in, particularly in the book, Japan is #1, I thought I'd give the background and the reaction, the response to that. And then, of course, I'd be delighted to hear questions. When I first started teaching a course on Japanese society in the end of the 1960s, I didn't have enough books to put on the list. There weren't that many books on Japanese society to use, and I really had to scramble and figure out a way to have enough things. Now, of course, in almost any specialty, you got so many books in the Japanese villages, Japanese poetry, literature, anime, all kinds of topics. And so the graduate student now who wants to work in a subfield has to read so many things on that subfield. I think one of the good things about the era I grew up in is because there were so few things in your own field, the people you talked to had other fields. So the conversations that you had about Japan, I would meet with historians and political science and economists, and we would talk about our common interests, because that was the audience and that was the community of people who worked on Japan. And I think that was very great. As I see it, what really made Japanese studies after World War II was the fact that the United States finally recognized its responsibility as an international power. And if you go back to the efforts of Woodrow Wilson after World War I, couldn't even get the Americans to join the League of Nations. And that we were really very much of an isolationist power. But after we'd been in 2 world wars, we got the message that we were an international power, and therefore we wanted to make a contribution to developing a global structure. In order to do that, we had to have a good understanding of the major countries around the world, and we then began to set up those various kind of centers. And fortunately, at that time, the American Council of Learned Societies, that composed the Humanities, and Social Science Research Council, composed of social sciences representatives, as they thought about how to develop the fields, they, in order to get it into the mainstream of American academic life, they decided to link it up with the disciplines. I remember talking to one old senior professor of Harvard who worked there in the 1930s, who said, you know, in my generation, we were all a bunch of oddballs. We had our own little interests. But after World War II, a lot of people wanted to get in the mainstream. And so instead of Japanology or Sinology, it was a discipline. And so after World War II, I think the linking of Japan to those disciplines and sort of beginning to develop a group of people. And of course, the advantage that we had at that time was that there were quite a few people who had served in World War II. I think in World War II already we realized that we had to know a lot about other countries. And as a result of that, you wanted to train a lot of people, particularly to know your enemies, and that meant you had to train people in Japanese language. I remember talking to George DeVos, who was one of the early people at the University of Michigan, who was part of the center after World War II, about how he happened to study Japanese. And he wanted to study Russian, he said. But in order to get into language training in World War II, you had to have a very high IQ. So it's either the top 1% or 2%. So we got a lot of very bright people studying languages. And George said that when they got to the training center, where all these people who had passed and were going to go into language training, they said, okay, line up. And they all lined up by size. And he said, all right, you tall guys, you study Russian. And you middle-sized guys, I forget what country, and you short guys, you study Japanese. He was short, so he studied Japanese. That's how he got into Japanese studies. But of course, right after World War II, there were about a half a dozen universities that moved quickly into trying to get people in each different discipline. The ones I think that really stood out were Harvard, Columbia, Michigan, California, Seattle. There were some others, but in my memory, those were the ones that really did well. And the people who took charge were mostly people who had served in the war. And I think Michigan was really one of the strongest of those, and they were lucky to get such very good people. John Hall, who, I don't know, how many of you know about these people already? I don't want to repeat. Is this story well known to? Sorry to repeat a little bit. So John Hall was a missionary kid and had come back and gotten his PhD with Ed Reischauer immediately after World War II. And then when Michigan was expanding in the late 40s, John Hall came in history, and Bob Ward came in political science, and Dick Beardsley came in anthropology, and George DeVos was in anthropology, psychology, and there were other people. I think Seidensecker was here for a while, and they provided a kind of an overall perspective. And I think because Michigan set up a field site in Okayama, it was especially strong in developing a locality in that area. At Harvard, we had John Pelzel in anthropology, and we had Ed Reischauer in history, and Then we had Henry Rosowski, who grew up in economics and political science. We really didn't have, well, Ed Reichar was kind of history and political science. So we developed that program. And in the field of Japanese sociology, there was almost nothing. And the people, the books that I could think of are the kind of scholars that we could use when we first started putting together courses in the early 60s. John Embry was one of them. John Embry was an anthropologist trained at the University of Chicago, as I remember correctly. And he had gone there and done very good field work. He was an extremely bright guy. So in World War II, he was asked to put together his book Suyemura, which came out as a village study, and then he wrote another book on the Japanese nation. And he was going to set up Japanese studies at Yale after World War II, and unfortunately, he died very quickly. So that never really blossomed, and Yale didn't really become a big center for Japanese studies at that time. And so that was probably the best account we had of Japan before World War II. And then World War II, of course, when Japan became the enemy and the OWI became the center, Ruth Benedict was in charge. And her job was to try to understand the enemy. And since Japan was at a distance, what then became known as studying culture at a distance. You would study their literature, you would study their history, you would, of course, use the Embry's books. But also, she found that there were several young Japanese in the Army who had become American citizens, and she interviewed them. And I remember talking to one of them, Scotty Matsumoto, who was interviewed and also did a short little book at that time. And he said that we lived in terror that Ruth Benedict was going to invite us to her table at lunch, because she would just question and quiz and go over and over all the little things that they had ever done. And she wanted to know every little detail. Of course, the picture that comes out from her book, Chrysanthemum the Sword, is, in a way, I very thought she was a brilliant person who captured a lot of the essence. And it was at the time when people in the U.S. were concerned, why is it these people are so dedicated? Why do you have kamikaze fighter pilots who are willing to risk their death? And why are they sort of determined? And she got into all the reasons why Japanese felt they had giri, or gimu, different kinds of sense of responsibility. And she put that in a broad social context. And I think the picture that emerges is a somewhat idealized, romanticized picture of how obligated the Japanese felt and how much responsibility. I think those of us who did field work in the 1950s felt that that book was a little too stiff. It was more complicated. There were more different kinds of people. There were other things than the responsibility, but that was the picture that emerged at that time. When I started my first field work in Japan was 1959. I went there in 1958 for a year of language study. And in those days, frankly, we didn't have a very good language school. The place I went was called Naganuma. And no matter, every time we said something in Japanese, the teacher would say, Joseph, Joseph. And so we didn't learn good pronunciation. We didn't learn systematic things. I had to go back and get retrained much later, which was a very painful process. And it wasn't until the university set up the International Language Training Program, the University International Program that moved from central Tokyo, later out to Yokohama, that the Inter-University Language Center that really set standards and really served our universities. And then, of course, now I think the linguistic analysis and the teaching of language is so much better that the one thing that's really improved, in my view, in Japanese studies is language training. And of course, the specialties, the amount of knowledge that we have in all those special areas. I think we've lost some of that overview that we got from the days in the 1950s when we didn't really know all that much about any detail, and we had to talk to people with different specialties. I think that was, in some ways, those of us that took part in that were really very lucky. Now, when I started my field work in urban Tokyo, what my original thesis in Harvard had been on families with emotionally disturbed kids and then families with normal kids. So I got a 2-year postdoc, 1-year language study, 1 year to study the same kind of thing in Japan. So we set up a program where I would interview families of normal kids, and then we had 6 matched families of who had emotionally disturbed kids. And we couldn't interview quite as regularly. The program in Harvard that I'd grown up with, and what I think was most useful for my training were 2 things I got. One was what Talcott Parsons meant, and he thought he was creating a social science that didn't quite turn out that way. I mean, it didn't quite become systematic and didn't develop into science. But he tried to think systematically about, say, global society, and then every subgroup, a nation or a community or a family, and to look within that at certain basic questions, what was their economic basis, their political organization, the social structure, the underlying values, and sort of think systematically about the relationship of those for each level. One of the things he taught us was always remember your frame of reference. Are you talking about the nation? Are you talking about the global thing? Are you talking about a subgroup? Are you talking about some particular family or some particular enterprise? Always look at that unit, but then think of how that's related to the broader perspective. So I think that provided a broad perspective. The other kind of thing that I liked about my training was intensive interview and training. And we saw the same families as a project I worked on for over a year, and we visited them each week. And what we learned in our interviewing was always try to develop personal relationships with them. The way you understand people is not by being detached and objective. That's an impossible goal. You have to form a relationship, and then you want to understand the nature of that relationship. And then by understanding that, then you can use that to factor in what was really going on in that family. But you have to relate to people. You can't, the interviewer who, this really came from anthropological interviewing that our teachers, some of them had been in primitive tribes, or Navajo, of course, was the big place where a lot of them had worked. And the effort was to form relationships, but then understand, get to know those people extremely well, understand their thinking. And the kind of questions you raise in interviewing was things to try to get them to think. You show your interest. The most valuable tool in interviewing is having a genuine interest in trying to understand those people and sympathize and see things from their point of view. And one of the favorite things you would do was try to think of puzzles, like you did this when you were 18, and then at 22 you switched and did something different. Why did you switch and do something quite different? It's to try to get the people to think through and talk spontaneously about what mattered to them. Another thing that we learned in the interviewing was always follow the affect. That's a term that came from psychiatry. But whenever a person you're interviewing shows emotion, that's something you want to find more about. So when a person got upset or angry or happy, or you said, that damn person, then you want to find out why he's a damn person, why that person, what's the context was, why you felt that way, is that still the case? Are there other people who fall in that same kind of category? So by following the emotion, you get to things that are really important and touch the depth of that person. So anyhow, those are the training things. I think from now on, what I'll do is mostly talk about personal experience, sort of how I went about things, and then in the end I'll give an old person's advice to young people working on these. When I was out there for field work, I was originally going to write up how emotionally disturbed kids' families and other families compare to each other. But when I got into it, that didn't seem all that different from what I'd learned in the United States. So what I did get interested in one day, one of the ladies I was talking to said, you know, we salaried, her family was a business family. And she said, you know, we're different from those salaried men's family. And so she then started describing those differences. And suddenly a whole bunch of things sort of began to fit together. And as somebody who wanted to describe what social structure was all about, I felt that really sort of set off things. I mean, one of the things that we noticed in our study was how much of the family mother's time was spent getting kids ready for exams. So we wanted to understand, until that time, nobody had really written up the examination, so, and what it meant for kids getting ready for those exams, and just figuring out why. And then, what's the importance of exams? Well, it's so you can get into a good school, so you can get a good job at a big company or the government. If you were going into a business family or a farm family, those entrance exams weren't that important. It was really part of that same structure of large firms that people would spend most of their career in. So we want to understand how those salary people thought about their career, how their entrance to the career, what the nature of their family life was different from the families, say in the countryside, where they had longer family history, but they were not concerned about exams and security. Then what we also found was that in a way that salary man, just as Japan was growing, was becoming kind of a new model for other people's lives. I remember one of my colleagues who was doing field work the same time I was in Japan, David Plath, who was an anthropologist from Illinois. And he said he was talking to those farmers in a rural community up in the Alps, and he said that they told him that, look, we're putting money aside in our collective community, and then we pay out money to us at the end of each month, just like salary people. And we're going to have the same regularity of life that they do. And just as the salary man could begin to plan, say he could buy a television next year if he could save so much, and then with a bonus at the end of the year, he would have that much money he would be able to buy, and then a few years later they would be able to buy a car. You could sort of plan that. And then the farmers and other people could sort of go along with that and have that as their kind of model, so that the salaryman's life and the large corporation, which had long-term employment, was set kind of a pattern for other groups in society as society grew. Then a few years later, when we went back to that place, and we kept touch with that community all the time. I go back to Japan every year, and I try to go visit my old fieldwork site, which is in Chiba-ken no Ichikawashi. And so I try to go back there every year and keep in touch with a lot of the same families that we met a long time ago. And although only two of the housewives are still alive, our kids have gotten to know their kids. And so we've kept up relations with a number of those families, which serve as an interesting baseline for us. And I feel very lucky that I got into the Japanese family life, understood that way of thinking before I got into Japanese government and business studies. Well, anyhow, after I came back and started teaching about Japan, I would continue to make visits, but I didn't have a full year sabbatical until 1975-76, which was quite a bit after I returned in 1950. And 75-76, we had a full year. So I wanted to do a follow-up study. Let me go back just before that, though, because in the late 1960s, I was assigned to teach a course on Japanese society at Harvard. Until that time, my friend Bob Bella had taught the course. Now, Bob Bella was another Parsons student, and he was very interested. He did his PhD. He was impressed by Max Weber and wanted to understand, you know, since Japan didn't have Protestant ethic and that kind of background that led to industrialization, what was the business ethic in Japan? And he found a guy named Ishida Baigon, who had written sort of philosophy of a small businessman that became kind of a model and sort of explained their ethic. But in any case, he taught a course at Harvard on Japanese society, and then he accepted a job at Berkeley. So that nobody was teaching it, and so I was allowed to start teaching that course. And because I'd worked only on the family, I felt I ought to learn more about other parts of the society. So in '69, when I was there for a few weeks, I think the whole summer, '69, I was trying to get ready for my course, and so I wanted to interview a lot of people in government and in business so I get a fuller picture of the broader society and not just the family. Then in '75, '76, when I had a full year sabbatical, I decided that I wanted to study the Zeikai. Now the reason, the Zeikai, the business community. And the reason was Ed Reischauer, when he talked about Japan, he said there are kind of three main components. There is the politics and the bureaucracy and the business community. And the business community, you know, Kei Danren, Keizai Doyukai, and so forth, was a very important part. And so I went in '75 and I started interviewing those people in the business community. And when I went one by one around all the things, I could see how much Japan had changed since we'd come back home in 1960 from the 2 years. And in those, from 1960 to 1975, just extraordinary changes. And I felt, as an American scholar, my job is to help wake up the Americans. And what I felt, and I got this also from Fairbank and Reischauer, is that we who have the privilege of getting finance from from the government and foundations, have an obligation beyond our own students. Those of us who are recipients of those national programs have a responsibility to the American people as a whole. And that I had a responsibility for teaching more Americans about Japan. And so in 1975, 1976, when I got through that, I started to write a short article on how much progress Japan has made. And when I started thinking about, you know, as a sociologist, what are the social institutions that work pretty well? What are the patterns, you know, that explained why they have loyalty to the company, how well the bureaucracy works, why do they have low crime rate, why do they have such high educational standards, why do they live so long, to try to understand those social institutions. So my thought was, if I could write a book about that, and I went to a small, Ohio Wesleyan is a small town Christian university where we had certain kind of moral obligations. In part, you know, if we could make good use of the Japanese example to learn things that we ought to do to respond, and what we could do to get more community solidarity, what we could do to raise quality of our products. So as Japan was, I knew Japan was going to come up and be a stronger competitor, and we ought to get ready for it. And I thought the way to get ready for it would be a wonderful way to try to strengthen our own institutions, and that I could teach things about Japan that did quite well. So when I kept adding to that over the next 2 or 3 years, and finally I decided I really was like a preacher. I wanted to preach to American society and say, learn from these guys. And I wanted to get a title that was shocking. And so that's how I picked the title, Japan is Number One. Those who read the book know that I didn't argue that Japan was going to be the biggest economy in the world. I argued that in a number of regards, Japan was doing extremely well. In those days, if you look at international school kids' scores, Japan got the highest. In terms of longevity, Japan had the longest lifespan. Crime rates just about the lowest in the world. So there were a number of good things, and so what I meant by Japan is Number One was that they were doing well in a lot of those areas. Unfortunately, the world didn't understand. I mean, the people who didn't read the book didn't always understand what I was meant. And so the question I was always asked was, well, are they going to be number one now? Are they going to pass the United States? And then later, I was asked every year, Japanese reporters come to me, why isn't Japan number one anymore? So that was, one of the things that comes. When the book first came out, I think the predominant reaction in the United States was, that guy, he's been in Asia a little too long, and he has an exaggerated picture of what Japan is going on, and it's interesting, but it's a little overdone. About 10 years later, as Japan kept on growing, a lot of us said, gosh, that guy really had foresight. Then 10 years after that, the Japanese say, yeah, bari machigata na. The guy didn't get it right after all. I mean, he didn't seem to understand. He was really wrong and greatly exaggerated and turned out not to be prophetic. I think those are the overall reactions. But the book did have interesting impact. And in the United States, for example, Bob Cole, who was here, was invited to take part in a lot of studying Japanese quality groups. And I got visited by Ford Foundation executives. What can we do to keep up with the quality? And I think, one of the earliest positive reaction to the books was by American company executives who could see that they were going to have competition from Japan. And there were some people in General Motors who were so cocky that they thought, they didn't need to worry about this. I remember one time General Motors had a kind of retreat for some of the executives, and Jim Beglin, was another guy who worked on Japan, and I and several others were invited in to talk about Japanese industry. And we talked, and the reaction of the General Motors executives, we're so strong, we're number one, and those guys, they're never going to catch us. And we tried to tell them, no, you're underestimating this competition, but they didn't listen. I mean, that's the end of the thing. But there were some guys in Ford and some other places who realized that, look, this quality, and so they bought a lot of copies of my book to send to their employees, for which I was very thankful. And so some of these business people really thought that this Japanese competition, my book would be very useful for stimulating their employees to get ready in those areas where they really had to do better and compete. And there was a company in Cleveland called TRW. There was a guy named Reuben Mettler, who was a big executive in a lot of the national business organizations, who could see that you needed to work. And then there were a number of people in Congress, and there was a guy named John Bowles that I knew, who had been, is related to Chester Bowles, who was a politician. John Bowles was a very smart guy who worked in Washington, knew a lot of Congress people. And he decided that we ought to have a big conference to sort of publicize Japanese successes. And so he got the New York Stock Exchange and some people, Ribicoff, who was a congressperson, to be the leaders in organizing a conference with Harvard University to try to study Japan example and to sort of call the attention to the American business community about the coming competition. So there were a lot of people who got involved in that. And I think as a whole, the reaction was very healthy. The book also had an impact in other countries. It became kind of of course I don't think it was my book, and of course it wasn't my book alone, but I think it did play a role. For example, Mahathir of Malaysia had a look east policy, was to look to Japan. That came right after my book came out. One of the most interesting times I had was in Singapore. And Lee Kuan Yew he told all his cabinet to read my book. And he invited me to come to speak. And there were 2 or 3 times I went to Singapore to speak. And I took part in one big conference. It took me a while. I didn't get it. I mean, what I was supposed to do. And this conference was on labor strategies. And what I was supposed to do, what I later understood, I was supposed to tell about how in Japan the labor unions got along with management so well, that it was a benign labor movement. And what did the Japanese do so that labor unions would be benign and get along with the company, so that they could then keep long-term employment and have happy relation, no strikes, no outbreaks. So they were to study the Japanese example. And my role was to explain how the Japanese achieved that. Another thing, he found out that because of the crime rate was so low, how did they manage that? Well, they had the koban, the local police box. And so he got a bunch of the local police from Japan to come to Singapore to lecture on how they did that. And the guy who was Japanese ambassador to Singapore at that time later said to me, "Vogel, you caused us a hell of a lot of trouble." And I said, what do you mean? I didn't realize I was calling. He said, well, after you were there, we got bombarded by the Singapore government. They always wanted to study more about Japan. I had to spend my whole time as ambassador there trying to find more people to come from Japan to give speeches on one thing and another that they really wanted to learn from Japan. So there were some places in Asia, Taiwan and South Korea. South Korea was interesting because they, to talk, about the problems of Japan and Korea now, they didn't like to praise too much Japan publicly. So the book was never published in Korea, but there was a brief, the foreign ministry, I think it was the foreign ministry, some of the government in South Korea, they summarized the thing, put it out in Korean, not for sale, but widely distributed to companies in South Korea to try to get them to study the Japanese model and pick up what they could to learn from Japan. So in short, there was quite an impact of what people were learning from Japan. Then when a few years later, when reporters come to me and they say, well, what happened to Japan? And especially now that the Chinese economy in total size passed that Japan, a lot of reporters from China as well as Japan and other places come asking, what happened? What happened to the relationship of all these things that you said those things were good things were in Japan, why isn't it working? I'll tell you my general answer. That is, if you look at the financial pages, and which dominate our newspapers, and you say, would you want to invest in Japan? Probably not. It's probably not going to grow that rapidly. But if you look at it as a sociologist, say, is society working? It's doing pretty well. And if you think, my friend Ron Dorr, who is an extraordinary, broad-gauged, knowledgeable scholar, who says, we are, after all, stockholder culture, and we do things for the stockholder. And that's a mess, that there are a lot of stakeholders in businesses. They're the employees, they're the community. And if you say, You know, the American newspaper writes up that the Japanese companies are slow to respond to the economic changes. They don't get rid of enough people, and so their companies don't earn money, and that they're losing money for their stockholders, and they're failing. If you say, what does that do for society when they look after people and keep them on? Of course, it's a more stable society. If you say, what is it doing for people who want to be committed to the community? And if a Japanese company doesn't easily move out of community because they got responsibilities to that community, they will do it when they have to, and they do. Of course, they are interested in profit. But there is a concern for society, and that Japanese society remains very strong. So when people tell me that I way overestimated Japan, of course Japan does have problems. It's been a big adjustment. Once growth slowed down, you had a certain kind of pattern of growth. When growth slowed down, it creates a lot of difficulties, and we're not completely out of the woods yet. But if you say, what's the crime rate in Japan? It's still very low. What's longevity? It's still the highest. What's the quality of young children getting ready to school? It still ranks extremely high. There are problems in the bureaucracy and the government. There are a lot of problems I'm sure you people know in much more detail than I do. But I think as a whole, it does quite well. And I thought I would say in the end, you know, what lessons I have for young people to go about their studies. One is that think of using your first studies where you get deep into Japan, and think of the possibility in keeping in touch with that place, whatever it is, of following it over the career and making friends. And in my view, there's nothing that's so important that you want to ruin your relationship. Some, you know, reporters are so anxious to get some things in the paper that they sometimes reveal things that shouldn't reveal. And I never felt that there was anything that we had to reveal that would hurt people. And if they want things to be kept confidential, you can often find indirect ways of getting at things, explaining things, saving their names, saving their particular, disguising their company, but giving the spirit of what you found out. So I think there's nothing that you need to do to sacrifice the people you've interviewed with. And think of the possibility of keeping sometime long-term relationship. When you do your first study, or some of your first studies, think of those connections that you could use. Another thing I think is that for intensive understanding of people, that connection, there's nothing better than connections. If you go out cold and start in a new community, you don't, you often have trouble. But if you use students and friendships, and then you build those networks of friendships, you can learn a lot. I've had a lot of special luck because a lot of the people I got to know in the 50s and 60s later rose to higher positions, and you can follow them, and you can often learn things from them that an outsider coming in for the first time can't learn. And I think to make good use of those. And then I think that even though to get jobs now, you often have to use a lot of statistics and theory, that in my experience over 50 years, theories have come and gone. That good, accurate descriptions of life last. If you want, there are a lot of people who still want to go back and figure out, what was going on in life in a certain place at a certain time, and they're interested in that history. But what were the theories that were used in the 1950s and 60s? Maybe my view is very one-sided, and there are other people who would have a very different view. But for what it's worth, I throw out my view that theories are often useful, give you insight, help you think, but get at realities and what's really going on, and those have lasting social value and interest. And no matter what you do, even if your field changes, that provides a very good basis. Well, anyhow, those are some of the advice I would give, and I think we're very fortunate in this country that even though universities are having financial trouble, in Michigan, with its car industry, it has more troubles than a lot of places. I think the fact that you have solid foundation money, I think foundation money for universities has turned out to be a wonderful thing, because that provides a stable basis for income that lasts. So when you have a chair that has a good financial basis, I think that financial system has provided enormous vitality to our universities that can continue to provide good education, so that even in the years ups and downs, when Japan is less popular than China or some other less interest, there'll still be a lot of opportunities, and that these chairs will still provide the continuity, so a lot of you will be able to do your work. We also have now too many well-trained people for universities positions. So a lot of you who are trained for university positions will find your careers in businesses, think tanks, public relations, companies, all kinds of places. But I think that universities still provide an important base and a home base to keep in touch with and to keep preserving academic studies. Anyhow, those are the 2 cents of an old man. Thank you very much.